Hello, Elliot and Rebecca. Welcome back.
Hi.
So good to see you. It's been a while since we met and discussed about C.S. Lewis's Surprised by Joy. And here we are, our final and third segment of this reading discussion group for C.S. Lewis's Surprised by Joy. So let's dive right in to chapter 11 to 15, last portion of this amazing book. I really got even more out of it this last reading. I read it several times. It just confirmed in me the value of reading classics, the value of reading C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, to me, is one of the most articulate, I would say, Christians in all of Christian history. So I love C.S. Lewis, easily one of my all-time favorite Christian authors. Not only literature, Narnia series and all that, but an apologist. If you're someone who explains rationally, and this is a biography, a kind of a conversion story of C.S. Lewis's life, and I gained deeper insights into how one becomes a Christian. Of course, everybody has different patterns in how they become a Christian, but I think there's some of the things that you find in his story universal, something that everybody can experience as well. So without further ado, let's just begin this discussion. Elliot, C.S. Lewis describes his journey of joy. I mean, the whole thing is about how he's experiencing joy, right? And in his description, he says that he began to realize that his old thrills, right? He calls it old thrills, was not the same thing as his original joy. What do you think he meant by that?
For this, when I read this section, I kind of related it to like our habits in a way where we have things that we're comfortable with and that we find comfort in. And I think sometimes there are times where we're drawn back to what we were comfortable with before, and that at times draws us away from God and kind of gets in the way and causes confusion from.
Yes, confusion is the word. So he uses the word introspection to kind of describe this danger, right? This old thrill he describes as a deadly error. And at some point, he says on page 207 at the bottom, in the error, he said he discovered two errors, right? Dangerous errors. And the first one is that having falsely made, like seventh line from the bottom, having thus falsely made a state of mind his aim. So the old thrill that he's discovered as being a deadly error is like thinking of some state of mind, like let's say you're sitting in a church and somehow you're praying, or Koreans like 주여, or something like that, and you just like that, like catharsis, I have a great, and then the second error is to attempt to produce it, like 그때 그게 참 그때 뜨거웠지. 근데 그 상태, 그 state of mind를 reproduce 하는 것이 dangerous error라는 거예요. 깨달음.
Yes.
So he's always like, 그치. 언젠가 그때 진짜 나가 뜨거웠지. Because he wants to go back and reproduce it. He realized how dangerous that is.
Yeah.
Do you have any similar experience?
I think it is very common for even people who grew up Christian, like idolize certain types of like experiences, especially like if there's an annual church retreat that would easily be like, let me just be like feel that like burning heart again, and then like really depend on like those retreats, or it really, I think I totally understood how he said like a lot of it is based on like experience or like past memory, and we are trying to like reproduce it instead of like fundamentally understanding why that joy came to us when it happened.
Thank you very much. I hear a lot of young people say the same thing. They get stuck into that, what do they call it? The high, like the spiritual highs, right? So, Rebecca, a follow-up question is, so Lewis recognizes this deadly era of introspection, which is kind of looking, examining, where am I, where just reproducing his state of mind. But at the same time, Lewis was afraid of believing in a supernatural world of Christianity. So, he's caught in between these two. Like, he's, on the one hand, he realizes it's dangerous to look into himself. But on the other hand, he doesn't want to just believe in a supernatural world either. So this he's like, he's caught in between. Does that in any way describe like people today, young people today?
I think the fear on like supernatural world is like totally understandable, because like he talks about in page 211, he talks about how the horror of the Christian universe was that it had no door marked exit, and the fact that there is something beyond death, and the idea that there is something greater than our experience can be very terrifying, especially in a world where we are really asked to control our life and to have everyone wants to know what is happening on in their life, and everyone wants to have a grasp of it and wants to be the one who's controlling it through knowing. And believing in supernatural world is simply acknowledging that there are things that are beyond our control. And I think as young people these days are very afraid of that, because we are taught and raised to be the owners of our lives,
Absolutely. Well said. I think that describes perfectly the so-called Gen Z, right, of today. On the one hand, they're always looking at themselves through social media, and they like to post images of themselves. They know that they're not happy. Deep down, they're always sad, and they keep getting addicted into the social media, which is a projection of themselves. But on the other hand, they don't want to believe in a supernatural God, because as you say, they want the control. They don't want to lose the control of their own lives. So our generation is living in that dilemma as well. So Elliot, so there's this first major turning point in Lewis's life, and that was when he picked up a book, Phantastes by George MacDonald, at a train station, right? Waiting for a train. And can you describe that radical change of experience that he had while reading that Phantastes book?
So I guess like the biggest difference was, like, as he was describing like his experience in reading the book, like the big word was he felt holiness from the book.
Holiness.
And yeah, which was the biggest difference. And just like moving on, like I realized that later on he says like he sees like the light and this bright shadow coming out of the book. And I remember, I think it was our second time meeting, we kind of talked about how Lewis felt joy through kind of like the common things, and he realized that some of the joy that he feels through his literature can be found in like the simple things that we can enjoy in our just normal daily lives. And it says in the book where, but now he saw the bright shadow coming out of the book into the real world and resting there, transforming all common things and yet itself unchanged. So I think it's just like reiterating that just these common things, which are mostly overlooked, is what can, bring us joy and like kind of show us the light in a sense.
Absolutely. So before he read this book, the way he thought about joy, right, was more like just an inner kind of experience, right? Some kind of spiritual experience. But he never experienced it through his ordinary experience, just in nature or ordinary things in life, until he read Phantastes, right? And just reading through that book, somehow he felt the light came down and just rested there, infused in everything around him. And it didn't leave, it was just kind of there. And in theological language, we call this the immanence of God, right? There's the transcendence. God is transcendent. He is not us, and he is control over us. He is absolute sovereign. But at the same time, he's right here near us. He never saw it both happening at the same time until Phantastes.
Yeah. And I think he also talks about how it became like inseparable from his life, like the story that he read. Which is,
Right. So this changed the way he looked at everything, right? It's the first major turning point in becoming a Christian. And this became a mark of a great, it's a new standard of appreciating everything in life, and especially literature. So I guess I could continue to ask you, Elliot, what are some of the best literature from that point on?
So, I actually had a hard time with this question, but
actually, the answer he says it later on in later chapters. Milton, Spencer, and Johnson.
Okay.
Yeah, it's in later chapters, but these literature, like Milton, for example, Paradise Lost, it's a masterpiece because it talks about God's grace. It's not only very supernatural, but it's at the same time very natural. That quality of literature is what makes it truly great literature. And he names some of them, like even the Greek, like Plato, Aeschylus, and then Virgil, right? Latin writers. So moving on, Rebecca. So in the next chapter, Guns and Good Company, he talks about his experience in World War One, which was a terrible experience. But the way he talks about his experience is like, it's actually better than most of my previous experience in schools.
Yes.
Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was interesting how he was talking about how it was unimportant to him. And of course, he experienced death, cold, hunger, and all that through the war experience. But he also says that since he was expecting it to be that bad, it was not as like deteriorating to him. And also he had a lot of like people who were nice to him and were taking care of him. And he talks about how in page 232 he says, every few days one seemed to meet a scholar, an original poet, a cheery buffoon, a raconteur, or at least a man of goodwill. And the term like a man of goodwill. So like I think in such a hard time, like they were able to still carry that heart, to have that genuine good heart to each other. And I think that was important. And he also talks about this person called Johnson. And he talks about how he learned so much from him in terms of like unexamined life, or the thought of like shame as well. And I think like it shows how God was gracefully giving him like these placing good people in his life, even in this like time of war.
Absolutely. I was reading recently a book called like this, is Joseph LeConte. If you look at this, it's called A Hobbit, a Wardrobe, and a Great War. So this book talks about how their experience, both Lewis and Tolkien, how their experience of World War One impacted them in a positive way. And that's what he's sharing here is meeting these people, Johnson, and then later he was reading Chesterton in the middle of the war. Meeting people like this, he met some of his favorite people during the war,
Mhm.
right? The Sergeant Ayers or something like that. And then this Johnson guy, he talks about this Johnson guy as a great combination of dialectical sharpness and
Mhm.
poetry, and a man of conscience.
Conscious, yeah.
He didn't realize how important it is to be a man of conscience.
Mhm.
You know, like speaking honestly,
Mhm.
speaking, he says, veracity, chastity, and duty. He's like, I never took that seriously until I met this man. So it's something about the war, the harshness of our suffering, that it's like the crucible of suffering that molds our character and our faith in God. So yeah, basically he's saying that his experience during this war truly, in a sense, drew him near to God,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
And we can talk so much about that, but then from there on, so it's a little by little, you see what's happening here is God is drawing him near. He sees God as moving him like a chess game of chess. He's moving piece by piece and moving him closer toward checkmate. And the next stage in his conversion story is he calls it, he fell into this problem called the new look. New look. So Elliot, what is this, the new look, and why is it so dangerous even for people today?
So for like this new look, he says that, or I think the most important part of it is no flirtations with any idea of the supernatural. And then like adding on to this, like no more pessimism, no more self-pity. And I think I feel like it's a danger because kind of like the way he explained it in the book was just so relatable to me. I think, and I think like I can speak for a lot of general people because of I get two of his reasons why he fell into this new look were people.
Right.
And his third reason was this new psychology.
Yes.
And this new ideology of that kind of redefined his idea of these fantasies and this feeling of joy or like his like escapes that he had. So I think like even today we're faced with just people around us and kind of like what society and the world tells us. And I think just as people, we're just easily swayed by these outside factors, which is why it can be so dangerous.
Yes, there's the new psychology. No pessimism, no self-pity, no flirtation with any idea of the supernatural. So these people may believe in the supernatural, that it exists, but like, don't let it get to you, you know, because it's going to mess up your life.
Yeah.
Just pretend like it's there and it's completely irrelevant with your life. All that's important is psychology. Like, just have a common sense and just do what you think is, you know, good, and that's enough.
Yeah. And I sense a sort of like intellectualism and autism here, like the fact that education and knowledge are like, it's almost a type of like hubris in a sense that we can understand every part of the world.
Exactly. This is the problem of the modern education. Exactly. The new psychology, like, just get educated and get a good job and you'll be fine. Just protect yourself. Right? This is the mentality that most young people are in. And all of this supernatural stuff is just a wishful thinking. So to summarize his where he is at this point, so he is beginning to see the danger of his introspection. Right? Stop looking into yourself because that's kind of dangerous. But at the same time, reject the supernatural. It may be there, but it can really mess you up. Just live a practical life. So you see what he's doing here. He's rejecting both what's happening inside of him. He's rejecting the supernatural world. I would say that fairly describes most young people living today, even Christians, I would say, right? They may go to church, they may believe in supernatural, but don't go too close to it. And don't look into yourself either. So then the next thing he talks about is a guy named Owen Barfield. Right, very interesting character in Lewis's life. He had a bunch of friends that influenced him, but Owen Barfield influenced Lewis in a very special way. Can you describe that, Rebecca?
Yes, he talks about, it's ironic how he calls this the Great War when he briefly mentions about the World War he actually experienced, but the Great War referring to how he was continuously having debates with this Barfield guy. And and he talks about how Barfield became an anthroposophist.
Yes, it's hard to say. Anthroposophist.
So, and how he was one of the Barfield was one of the people who influenced Lewis to believe in the new look, and
Yes.
now he became the one who believed in the world of spirit and
Yes.
supernatural. And he talks about how Barfield really made Lewis think about his own chronological snobbery,
Yes.
which is important. The belief that the new updated idea and theories are the best, and the outdated ones are not significant anymore. Lewis was able to really reflect on that idea and change that mindset and see his flaw in those ideas.
Yes.
And also, I think Barfield had a huge influence in making Lewis believe in the absolute and the spiritual being, that there is that one creator.
Right. Lewis says he disagreed with Barfield on just about everything they talked about, but later Barfield became one of the most influential friends to Lewis, and it's again, as you said, he was into New Look, like he rejected the connection with the supernatural. Then suddenly, this guy that he respects highly starts to believe in the supernatural world. You know, that the anthroposophists believe that there's a spiritual world and that you can understand it. It's intellectually accessible. And like that's dangerous for Lewis at that time. Like, I thought I don't want to have anything to do with the supernatural world. But here's my good, debate partner, Barfield. Like, not only is there a supernatural world, but you could understand it. And not only that, like through the medieval mindset, like we can learn so much from the medieval examples of thinkers who really understood the supernatural world. And he began to realize that he was chronologically practicing that snobbery, which means that he really should pay more attention to the old wisdom. So his what do you call it? His belief started to rattle and start to fall apart. You can't really pretend like just the supernatural world has nothing to do with you. So God is little by little saying, you can't ignore me, Lewis. I'm coming after you, right?
Yes.
So this leads him to the next stage where he meets some other friends like Neville Coghill, right? Another crucial, important turning point in Lewis's conversion story, who is described as a brilliant student, right? Smart guy, yet a thoroughgoing supernaturalist. So this was a big conundrum, big susukeke, for Lewis, because it's like, how can you be really smart and be a supernatural at the same time? Like, it's like oil and water. You don't mix that stuff. But like the more the more these friends pop up everywhere. So how Eliot did meeting people like Neville Coghill and Barfield, like how did they change the way he looks at books?
I think the biggest thing was where he kind of had that realization where his theory of life and what he experienced while reading certain books has been like completely changed.
Mhm.
I think with Coghill, he kind of put kind of two and two together and realized that from the authors or from the books that he's read and kind of like going into the background of the authors,
Mhm.
all of them all have experience or incorporate religion and
Mhm.
Christianity into their writing.
Mhm.
So I think it was just like at this point he was just putting piece and piece together and realized that, like how you said, wow, like God is just here and he's been here through and like trying to talk to me through like the literature that he's been reading.
Yes, they all have that in common, right? That presence of God in the natural world, our natural day-to-day ordinary experience, and again, people like Johnson, Spencer, and Milton. And what's the difference between, like, what do you realize these Johnson, Milton, that type of writers, and other so-called great writers, but that they're like atheists, like Shaw, Bernard Shaw, or Wells, Mill, Gibbon, Voltaire. What was the difference between these Christian authors and non-Christian authors?
So the specific word he used was that the authors are tinny.
Tinny.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
He's pretty much said that their kind of works are thin.
Thin.
And he realized that I guess different than kind of like Coghill and Johnson and Chesterton compared to Shaw, like Wells and Mill. I guess those writers that didn't have that contact with religion kind of had no depth in their writing.
Depth.
Yeah. And for him, that was boring.
Boring is the word. Boring, right? Can you imagine that? Like, do we actually believe that? Do Christian young people, when they read, can they tell, the difference between a boring piece of work? I mean, do you accept his challenge that non-Christian authors, no matter how good they are? Now, I've read some of these works, Shaw, Wells, Gibbon, the historian. Voltaire is considered the most brilliant thinker of his century. But speaking of Voltaire, when Voltaire read Pascal, living at the same time, Voltaire claimed, like, this guy is better than me. Pascal was much younger. And Pascal is a brilliant mind, right? Pascal's triangle, a brilliant mathematician and a Christian thinker. That's what Lewis is discovering, is like, no matter how good of a writer or thinker you are, you're ultimately too thin and too boring. A lot to think about there. Okay, so let's talk about now the moves, the 4 moves that God is making on Lewis. He said that God made these a series of moves, 4 moves, that really won over, right, Lewis's heart. And what were some of these moves, Rebecca?
So the very first move was reading the Hippolytus by Euripides again, and he talked about how he rediscovered that sense of longing that he lost before since book camp, and it is, I think it returns to that concept of like finding joy and finding for that missing piece. And the second move was after he read Alexander's Space, Time, and Deity, he really started to understand the distinction between enjoyment and contemplation and how they can't exist together. And
I want to stop you right there, because I thought I read this again and again, and I really, really found this second move to be very powerful. He found the difference between contemplation and enjoyment, and that you cannot do both at the same time. I don't know if you got that, but I had to reread it several times, like, oh my gosh, I finally understood what he's talking about, and I agree. Do you know what that difference is? What is contemplation and enjoyment? Let's say I'm taking this water, I can contemplate it, and I can enjoy it,
Mhm.
but you can't do it at the same time.
Mm.
What is he talking about here?
I think if it's really stuck in like only in your mind and only in what you think, that is much. You can't have the full experience of something, but
Yes.
if once you enjoy it, it
Yes.
means that you are actually diving into that world and getting the full experience.
Absolutely,
Mhm.
absolutely. Just anything that we're designed to enjoy. Let's say I love my wife, and just enjoying a good conversation with my wife.
Mhm.
And I just love her. I'm enjoying her.
Mhm.
Right? It's one thing to enjoy her. It's another thing to say like, like me spirit like come out of my body. It's like, David, why are you enjoying your conversation with your wife? Like I'm analyzing my enjoyment.
Mhm.
That just ruined it. I
Mhm.
just ruined my enjoyment. Enjoyment is you just gotta enjoy. It's the act of enjoying.
Mhm.
But once you step away and start to contemplate on it, like an object,
Mhm.
then you actually lost that pure enjoyment, as you say. And he found that it's such an important distinction.
Mhm.
It's so dangerous when we instead of just enjoying God, you analyze. You're like, okay, I got to do A, B, C in order to enjoy God. Like try to turn into a formula or something.
Mhm.
I think that's what he's talking about.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that is oftentimes what we try to do. That we because a lot of the things in this world are not fully understandable, and God is definitely one of them. Because how can we 100% understand the most greatest being on earth and in this entire universe? And I think once we try to contemplate God, it is more of, so who are you actually? But as God says, and as C.S. Lewis mentions later on how Yahweh says, I am who I am.
Right.
And I think that is the statement that defines enjoying God.
Yes.
God is who he is.
Right.
And he
Right.
can be in anything.
That reminds me of another C.S. Lewis quote. He says, the problem of modern man is that he tries to put heaven into... I'm sorry, this could be a Chesterton's quote. Anyway, the problem of modern man is try to put heaven into his head instead of his head into heaven.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We try to figure everything out about God.
Mm-hmm.
And that just kind of ruins it. God really wants us to just stick our head into heaven like, wow, this is so nice. Just take it in.
Mm-hmm.
What's the third and the fourth move then?
The third move was... Give me a second. The third move he talks about is how we are basically created based on the absolute he describes, and how without him we can't really simply reach to joy.
Yes.
And that realization that God is the center of our lives.
Center and the source.
Source.
It's like the sun. I mean, without the sun, we'll just shrivel up and die. And even our longing to the sun comes from the sun. It's he calls it centripetal. Centrifugal is going into everything's more selfish, self-centered. But now that it's the other way, it's like, ooh, it's going toward the sun.
And it's just, I think he talks about how it's just fragmentary, and it is just like a dream if we can not actually go to that center.
Yes.
And if we just float around.
Thank you.
Basically.
Thank you. Float around like ghosts.
Yes.
And then what's the final and the fourth move?
The final move, he talks about how he spiritually meets God, but before that, what really leads up to that point is Chesterton's Everlasting Man. And this is where when he really truly gets to understand what Christianity is. And he also talks about this atheist man who says rum thing, he went on, all that stuff of phrases about the dying god rum thing. It almost looks as if it had really happened once.
Mm.
And that realization that God, well, like Christ was actually here and he incarnated and he was a man just like us. And it historically happened.
Yes.
That realization that it is real
Yes.
was that fourth move.
Absolutely. So the incarnation of God, God becoming a man. And he knew this fact. He heard of it, in Sunday school, whatever. But it didn't hit him, right? Until this point, where so the God is not only there, but he absolutely wants a response from me, because he himself became a man. The implication of the incarnation of God is it's the final move. So, Elliot, this is continuing on that final move, in this chess game of God cornering Lewis into a checkmate position. He says, you must not do the will of the Father unless you're prepared to know the doctrine. All my acts, desires, and thoughts were to be brought into harmony with universal spirit. And then he talks about his conversion moment here. He's actually repenting, right? Can you comment on this turning point where he discovers what a sinner he is actually?
So, he says this is the first time where he kind of takes a step back and kind of looks back on himself, and he realized that he just kind of has a awakening a little bit where he goes wow, I'm filled with this much fear, I'm filled with this much I'm ambition, I'm nowhere near, I guess he's nowhere near what would be a good person in a sense, or a Christian in a way. But he kind of just looks back on himself and he realizes that he's just been filled with all of these things, and just kind of as he converts, he's I guess this is the first time we see that realization where he sees himself in such a dark light. Because I think throughout the book, I think he has that kind of pride in himself in a sense. And or the way I see it, even though he has had dark experiences, I think he himself made an attempt to find that light through those experiences. But I think this is the first time where we see kind of Lewis just sit down and be whoa.
So let's talk about that a little bit. This is literally, I would say, I would consider it, he doesn't consider it as a conversion point. I would say it's the beginning of his real conversion point. I love this classic line here on page 276 at the bottom. And there I found what appalled me. A zoo of lusts, a bedlam of ambitions, a nursery of fears, a harem of fondle hatreds. My name was Legion. Right? It's that crazy man, that demoniac in the Bible, right? My name is Legion. There's, how many soldiers are in a legion? 6,000 devils living inside of me. That's what it was. But let's talk about it. How does he come to see that in himself? Right? This remind me of Augustine's conversion story. At some point later in his adult life, he's walking with his friend, and they happen to just talk about what's going on. What is God doing in their lives? And he hears this little voice, tole lege, like a little kid singing, which is pick up and read. And he suddenly sees that God is telling him to pick up a Bible and read it. And so it's you know what? I think we need to go find a Bible. And he opens it, and it's Romans 13:13, which says, basically, sin no more. As the daylight, God is, it's God is shining light on you. And suddenly he sees how ugly, and a similar experience, how his heart is full of lust and ambitions and hatreds, selfishness. And then, he kneels down on the fig tree and he cries his eyes out. That's this moment here. So my question is, what caused him to see his sin? I think you said it, but what causes us to truly come to a repentance? It may not be directly in here, but I think it's kind of in he says, like, unless you're prepared to know the doctrine, you cannot do the will of the Father. You can't do the good things unless you know. He calls it the doctrine. But he really means like, know that there's a good and loving God.
And also, I think a lot of it also has to do with knowing how small you are. And it was interesting how he talks about Shakespeare and Hamlet, and how Shakespeare would have to choose to meet Hamlet if they ever meet.
Yes.
And I think it's significant in a sense that he recognized how spirit came to him instead of him choosing to
Thank you.
like bring in the spirit. And I think even as Christians, like I think we all experience that moment where we just realize how small we are and how weak we are as a human beings. And I think that is what C.S. Lewis really experienced here.
I think so. I think what he's saying is connecting with this whole incarnation thing. I think now he applied it personally. Somehow I think he realized that God came for me. He's a personal God here for the first time. He felt the love of God. And because he cannot deny the love of God, he begins to see his sin, his heart full of sin. Okay, so Rebecca, so he discovers this joy for the first time as a person, right? Instead of an idea. Okay, what impact did this discovery that God is a person have on Lewis?
Yeah, he actually explains how he briefly refers like how like the joy that he felt previously was not truly the one that he was looking after. Like it wasn't a place. Like he explains how joy was not a place, it was a person. And I underlined this sentence personally, but there was no strain of music from within, no smell of eternal orchards at the threshold. When I was dragged through the door, no kind of desire was present at all. So it was not about the pleasure and desire, and God is the desire himself.
Yes.
God is the joy himself.
Yes, that's the difference, the impact that it's no longer about his experience. Experience is good, it's a byproduct, but don't turn experience as the thing you're looking for. It's the person himself. In fact, he hears God's demand, this personal God demands, like, no more of that experience thing, no more. I'm the real thing. I'm who you want, not your experience. Wow. So Eliot, then he talks about that, like, until that point, he says he never thought about the future, heaven or hell, right? But then he began to think about that more and more, and why that made sense. He said, like, originally he thought, like, there's heaven and hell and promise, like, if you love me, you go to heaven. If you don't love me, you go to hell. He thought it was all so childish or something like that. But now he's like, it begins to make sense. How?
Well, I think he kind of talks about where he says, I have been brought up to believe that goodness was goodness only if it were disinterested, and that any hope of reward or fear of punishment contaminated the will. And I think he also says here that if heaven and hell had any substantial meaning apart from the presence of God, it corrupts the doctrine of both and corrupts us while we think of them. And I think, so
I remember in my college years, I remember in the dining room, there was this non-Christian across my table. And we're just, of course, I naturally just talk about God. And the guy says, I really don't like Christianity because it's selfish. Ultimately, it's selfish. And I thought about that. I'm like, oh, you're right. Because God wants people for himself, right? And like, I can't disagree with you. It's kind of right, but it's kind of like a right kind of selfishness. I don't think it's the same kind of selfishness as what we call selfishness. And I think this is the problem that he's overcoming here, right? You're like, if you're good to God, then you get to go to heaven. And it's like, what kind of is that? Like, I give you candy if you obey me. Sounds like manipulative, right? That's why non-Christians don't like Christianity. But it's only because they really fundamentally fail to understand why God is in a good kind of sense selfish. Because he's the goodness himself. Right? We're attracted by his kindness and his goodness. Don't we want to be in the presence of someone who is by definition good when we die? Yeah. So Rebecca, so Lewis says on page 284, for many healthy extroverts, self-examination first begins with conversion. For me, it was the other way around, meaning there was a conversion and then, I'm sorry, it wasn't conversion and then self-examination. It was the other way around.
Yeah.
All his life he's doing introspection, self-examination.
Yes.
And then he got converted, and guess what? He stopped examining himself.
Yeah, I think
Explain that.
it's interesting how he says in 285, to believe and to pray were the beginning of the extroversion for him. And I think this is significant because for his entire life, he was trying to understand what joy is, who God is. And he was always like trying to make it logical. And I think this is the point where he kneels down and surrenders and says, okay, God, I will surrender and pray instead of trying to logically understand everything. And I think this is significant because since this is the last chapter of the book, we've seen how much thinking he's been through, and to have this final KO sign from C.S. Lewis is almost it just speaks a lot to even non-Christians who would have similar experiences.
Yes. I really like the way he's finishing his conversion story here. He says, after he really felt accepted by God, he says he was taken out of himself. The problem with his whole life was he was way too interested in himself. And that was 괴로웠어. The problem is we are trapped in our own self. And conversion is when we're saved from that self-interest. So I'm going to jump to, for both of you, to the last question here, just for time's sake. How does the following comment describe Lewis's attitude about his spiritual journey? He says, page 291, when we are lost in the woods, the sight of a signpost is a great matter. But when we have found the road and are passing signposts every few miles, we shall not stop and stare. They will encourage us and we'll be grateful to the authority that set him up, but we shall not stop or and stare. Not on this road, though their pillars are silver and their lettering of gold. What is he talking about there?
I think ultimately it's about once we found God, the only step that is left is to go towards him, and there is no pausing and rethinking, but is he actually there or is he actually true? It is more of a lifelong journey to get closer to him, and God will be the one who is providing the signs and guiding us throughout the forest, I shall say.
Yeah, he may have this in mind, but Augustine in his book on Christian doctrine talks about the distinction between signpost, and what it signifies. That when we confuse the two, we are committing idolatry. And that this is what he said. If we confuse our experience of God with God Himself, you just committed idolatry. Like, that experience that we're trying to hold on to, that reproducing that some kind of experience, that could be an idolatry. Yes, it's a sign. It's a good sign. Signs are important. It's like, go this way. We don't look at go this way and like, oh, I love go this way, you know? So I think it kind of summarizes his problem and solution of his journey is, right? Let's not confuse the two. Because God is real, He loves us, and just focus on enjoying God, you know, on the path.
And I think it's just simply, like, it's just a way where, like, God just leads us. He just points us. He just points us in the direction, and then we just go. I think is what's important.
Yes. And of course, God is the one who put the sign there in the first place, guiding us every step of the way to find Him. So that concludes, wow, we did it!
Yes.
So what are some of your afterthoughts? We read through this whole conversion story of Lewis as an exercise of reading a classic. What are some of your takeaways from reading this book?
I think this book, just in general, was very relatable to me. And I think a lot of the things that kind of Lewis struggled with as a child and like as he was brought up was very similar in a way. And I think there's a lot to, like, with the relatability also comes with that much that comes out of it as I read. And I think just for this section, I would say one of the biggest takeaways was on page 277, where, kind of going back to question 9 about the repentance, it says the real terror was that if you seriously believed in even such a God or spirit as I admitted, a wholly new situation developed. And I guess once we kind of like dive deeper into this religion, that terror kind of comes from finding more about ourselves and seeing like how much of a sinner that we are. But also I feel like this could scare some people.
Yes.
But at the same time, instead of seeing as a fear, this whole new situation that is given to us, I feel like we can all kind of learn to accept it as like a new opportunity instead.
Absolutely. It reminds me of what Lucy says in Narnia about Aslan. It's like whoever told you it was a tame lion. You know, Aslan is not a tame lion. He's terrible. He could be scary, but he's good. It kind of reminds me of that. What are your takeaways?
First of all, I'm proud that I finished the book.
It's not easy, definitely.
Especially since just going to school and all that, I really stopped reading for fun or reading in my free time, and I think just forcing myself to read this book for this video and this book club, this gathering was just meaningful enough. And I think it was good in a sense that it reminded me of how we, like what Elliot said, we see ourselves in books, and we see ourselves in literature, and that's how we connect ourselves to the world, and that's how we connect ourselves to what God has created and what how God is working in this world. And I think it was like a good reminder on showing like how his love is fair for everyone and how his love is perfectly planned for everyone. And yeah, it was just, it felt like C.S. Lewis was just in this book. I mean, like, he was just, it felt so personal to a point where I felt like I was just listening to his testimony right next to him.
Yes, that's how I felt. Well, let's see. We started out this whole series as why read the classics?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think reading this book together has helped you to want to read more of these good books?
I think reading this
Mhm.
really made me see how many classics C.S. Lewis read. And for me, I always doubted, can we actually know God through classics? Because although there are a lot of great Christian writers as well, there are also very like strong atheist writers who are very against God. And I always had the question of like, will those books ever help me to understand God and to understand this world that God created? But just like seeing how Lewis explains how he found God through all those questions that he had through reading just reminded me, just showed me how reading classics is the way to understand God and understand his world.
Last words, Elliot?
I mean, it was. I really do believe it was a good read, but I don't know. I don't really like reading in the first place, but I think like because I feel like as students too, like especially I wouldn't say in college, but especially in high school, like when you like for your English class, you're given books to read every year, and I think kind of like for me. I would say like I've never kind of sought out to read. I was always given an opportunity or like whether it's for an assignment or like for this book club, I was given this book to read. And I think maybe like that, just that in itself, not maybe just by reading the book, but just thinking about how I've never sought out personally to read the book kind of made me rethink like maybe if I want to, maybe like having that want to like know more and kind of explore might be more beneficial to me is what I kind of got out of it instead of just always waiting like, oh, here's a book, like well, you should give it a read, but maybe I should just
mission accomplished.
Yeah. Broaden my perspective a little bit. And I also do know that to enjoy something, like you have to do it more anyway. So
contemplation and enjoy.
Yeah.
Thank you for your honest opinions and yes, Lord bless you as you continue to enjoy him through literature and through your studies. Thank you.
Thank you.